Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I know you use this video to fall asleep. I am here to help you today. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Tonight, I'll share with you a tale of terror and the unknown, a story that Sarah will never forget. It all began when she agreed to house sit a grand, secluded mansion. What seemed like a simple favor soon turned into a nightmarish ordeal. As the rain falls softly outside, let the darkness of the night surround you and listen closely as we uncover the chilling events that unfolded when the clock struck midnight. The Silent Tenant. In a small, quiet town in New England, nestled between misty hills and dense forests, there stood an old Victorian house known as Blackthorn Manor. The house, draped in ivy and shadow, had been vacant for decades, a relic of a bygone era. Most people avoided it, but when Sarah and her family moved into town, they were enchanted by its faded grandeur and bought it at an auction for a price that seemed too good to be true. The townsfolk were tight-lipped when Sarah asked why the house had remained empty. A knowing glance, a quick change of subject, these were the only answers she received. Undeterred, Sarah, her husband Tom, and their 10-year-old son Ethan moved in during the summer of 2023, excited to restore the house and make it their home. But from the first night, something felt wrong. The air inside the house was cold, even in the height of summer. The floors creaked under invisible footsteps, and at night, faint whispers could be heard, too quiet to understand but loud enough to disturb their sleep. Then there was the attic door. No matter how many times Tom secured it, the door would swing open by morning, revealing a narrow staircase that led into darkness. On the second night, Ethan, curious and unable to sleep, wandered upstairs. When Sarah found him, he was standing at the attic threshold, staring into the pitch-black void. "Who were you talking to?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan turned to her, his face pale, his eyes wide. "The man in the shadows," he whispered. "He says this is his house." The movers arrived early, their truck rumbling up the gravel driveway as Sarah stood on the porch of Blackthorn Manor. The house loomed behind her, its ornate wooden facade marred by years of neglect. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy of trees, casting dappled patterns on the cracked stone steps. Despite its worn state, the house radiated a strange allure, an unspoken promise of mystery and history. "Do you think we'll ever get used to this place?" Tom asked, stepping beside her and slipping an arm around her shoulders. Sarah smiled, though a shiver ran down her spine. "Give it time. Once we fix it up, it'll feel like home." Their son, Ethan, dashed past them, eager to explore. "I'm calling dibs on the biggest room," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew, mingled with a peculiar metallic tang. The grand staircase dominated the entrance, its banister carved with intricate patterns of vines and thorns. Dust motes swirled in the air, illuminated by a single beam of sunlight cutting through the half-shuttered windows. By the end of the day, boxes were scattered across the floors, and the movers had left. The family sat on the living room floor, eating pizza out of the box. Ethan, exhausted from his explorations, leaned against Sarah, his head nodding sleepily. "This place has a vibe, doesn't it?" Tom said, looking around. "Haunted isn't a vibe, Dad," Ethan mumbled, half asleep. Sarah chuckled, though she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had crept into her chest since they'd arrived. That night, after the family settled into their respective rooms, the house came alive. It began with faint noises, scratches in the walls, the groaning of old pipes. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and rhythmic, they echoed down the hallway. Sarah sat up in bed, her breath caught in her throat. "Tom," she whispered, nudging him awake. "Do you hear that?" Tom groaned and turned over. "It's an old house. It's probably just settling." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, and crept toward the door. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by a sliver of moonlight filtering through the windows. At the far end, the attic door stood ajar. She froze, her heart pounding in her ears. We locked that, she thought. She distinctly remembered Tom securing it earlier. Mom. Sarah whirled around to see Ethan standing behind her, rubbing his eyes. What are you doing up? She asked. I heard someone walking, he said. I thought it was you. No, honey. It's just the house making noises. Her words sounded hollow, even to herself. As she led Ethan back to his room, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The next morning, Sarah was determined to shake off the previous night's unease. She busied herself unpacking, humming softly to drown out the quiet. Tom headed to town to pick up supplies, leaving her and Ethan alone in the house. Ethan spent most of the morning playing in the backyard, but by noon, he came running into the kitchen, his face pale. Mom, there's someone in the attic. Sarah dropped the plate she was holding, and it shattered on the floor. What did you say? I saw him. He was standing by the window. Ethan's voice trembled. He waved at me. Sarah's first instinct was to dismiss it as a child's imagination, but the fear in Ethan's eyes was unmistakable. Grabbing a flashlight, she made her way to the attic. The door creaked as she pushed it open. A musty smell greeted her, along with the faint rustle of something unseen. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, trunks, and boxes covered in thick layers of dust. Sunlight streamed through a circular window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. Hello? She called, her voice echoing. The silence that followed was deafening. She stepped further inside, her flashlight cutting through the dimness. Near the window, she spotted a small rocking chair. It swayed gently, as though recently disturbed. Heart pounding, Sarah turned to leave. That's when she saw it. In the far corner of the attic, just beyond the beam of her flashlight, a shadow moved. It was tall, humanoid, but distorted, its edges seemed to flicker like static. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. Then it spoke. You shouldn't be here. The voice was a guttural whisper, like wind through dead leaves. Sarah dropped the flashlight and bolted, slamming the attic door behind her. She leaned against it, her breath coming in short gasps. Mom. Ethan's voice called from downstairs. Are you okay? She didn't answer. Instead, she turned the key in the attic door's lock and prayed it would hold. Sarah couldn't shake the encounter in the attic. That night, she lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Every creak of the house sent her heart racing. Tom, as usual, was fast asleep beside her. The memory of the shadowy figure replayed in her mind, its whispered warning echoing in her ears, you shouldn't be here. The next morning, after Ethan went off to school, Sarah decided to dig deeper into the house's past. She drove to the town library, a modest building with faded brick walls and tall, arched windows. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and varnished wood. She approached the librarian, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Hastings, who wore thick glasses on a chain around her neck. How can I help you, dear? Mrs. Hastings asked. I'm looking for information about my house, Sarah said. Blackthorn Manor. At the mention of the name, Mrs. Hastings stiffened. Her smile faltered, and she adjusted her glasses. That house has quite the history, she said carefully. You just moved in. Yes. But, Sarah hesitated. There've been strange things happening. Mrs. Hastings gave her a long look before nodding. Come with me. The librarian led Sarah to a dusty corner of the archives and began pulling out yellowed newspapers, old journals, and town records. Blackthorn Manor was built in 1892 by a man named Elias Blackthorn, she explained. He was an eccentric, some called him a genius, others a madman. He lived there alone for many years, conducting experiments. No one knew exactly what he was working on. Sarah frowned. What kind of experiments? Mrs. Hastings shrugged. Alchemy, the occult, maybe both. People said he was obsessed with opening a doorway to another realm. She handed Sarah a crumbling newspaper. The headline read, "Local recluse disappears without a trace." Beneath it was a grainy photograph of Elias, a gaunt man with piercing eyes and a severe expression. In 1910, Elias vanished, Mrs. Hastings continued. No body, no note. Just, gone. After that, the house changed hands several times, but no one stayed for long. People reported hearing voices, seeing shadows. Some claimed they were pushed or scratched by invisible hands. Sarah's stomach churned. What about the attic? Mrs. Hastings' expression darkened. Ah, the attic, she said, almost in a whisper. Legend has it that Elias performed his rituals there. They say he succeeded in opening his doorway, but he didn't close it. Whatever came through is still there. Sarah returned home with a stack of old documents and a growing sense of dread. She pored over them in the dining room, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the table. Each story she uncovered was more unsettling than the last. A diary entry from 1923 described a tenant waking in the middle of the night to find a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed. A police report from 1957 detailed a woman claiming her husband had been possessed and forced to attack her. And a recent article, dated 2003, told of a family abandoning the house after only 3 days, citing unbearable disturbances. As Sarah read, a faint noise caught her attention, the sound of footsteps above her. Slow and deliberate. She froze. The attic door. Grabbing her phone, she dialed Tom, but it went straight to voicemail. Taking a deep breath, she went upstairs to find the door to the attic wide open. The key was still in her pocket. This can't be happening, she thought, gripping the banister. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped inside. The rocking chair was moving again, creaking softly. But this time, she wasn't alone. Ethan stood in the middle of the attic, his back to her. Ethan, she cried. What are you doing up here? He didn't respond. She rushed to him and grabbed his shoulders, turning him around. His face was blank, his eyes unfocused. Ethan, she repeated, shaking him gently. He blinked, as if coming out of a trance. Mom, he said, his voice trembling. He told me to come up here. Who? She demanded. The man in the shadows, Ethan whispered. Tears welled in his eyes. He said he wants me to stay with him. A sudden gust of wind slammed the attic door shut, and the room plunged into darkness. Sarah clutched Ethan to her chest as the temperature dropped, her breath coming out in white puffs. From the corner of the attic, the shadowy figure began to emerge. It was larger now, more defined. Its edges flickered like static, and its form seemed to shift and ripple as though it wasn't entirely bound to this plane. Two glowing eyes, cold and malevolent, locked onto Sarah and Ethan. You've overstayed your welcome, the entity hissed. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding. Leave us alone, she shouted, her voice cracking. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. This is my house, it growled. And he belongs to me. The next morning, Sarah woke up on the couch, clutching Ethan. Neither of them remembered leaving the attic, but the memory of the shadowy figure loomed heavy. Ethan was pale, his usual lively demeanor replaced by a vacant, weary expression. I'm fine, Mom, he said, though his voice was weak. Just tired. But Sarah wasn't convinced. Something was draining him, and she feared she already knew what. Determined to save her son, Sarah returned to the old documents she'd collected. The journal of Elias Blackthorne became her focus. Its cracked leather cover and faded ink hinted at secrets best left forgotten, but Sarah read on. July 13, 1909, the doorway is nearly complete. I can hear them now, their whispers like a symphony. They promise knowledge beyond comprehension, power that transcends mortal limitations. August 1st, 1909, I saw it tonight. The shadow emerged, and though I should have feared, I felt awe. It has no form yet takes all forms. It is a being of pure will, a remnant of something far older than we can grasp. I am its vessel. The entries grew more frantic, more cryptic. Elias spoke of sacrifices, of offering life to sustain the being he had summoned. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting, chilled Sarah to her core. September 19, 1910, it demands more. It grows hungry, and I am not enough. The gate cannot be closed. May God forgive me. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the journal. The pieces clicked into place, the entity Elias summoned hadn't left. It had been trapped in the house, growing stronger with each passing decade, feeding on those who dared to live within its walls. And now it wanted Ethan. Over the next few days, Ethan grew weaker. He rarely left his bed, and when he did, he seemed disoriented. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his skin grew clammy. Tom brushed it off as a virus, but Sarah knew better. She began to notice other changes in the house. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and objects disappeared only to reappear in strange places. The whispers grew louder, forming half-sentences that Sarah couldn't fully understand. Once, while passing a mirror, she saw the figure standing behind her. When she spun around, it was gone. Desperate, Sarah sought out Mrs. Hastings again. Mrs. Hastings wasn't surprised to see Sarah return. "I thought you might come back," she said grimly. She handed Sarah a thin, brittle book, its cover emblazoned with an intricate symbol, a circle bisected by jagged lines. "This is an old text," Mrs. Hastings explained. "It contains a ritual to banish spirits and close doorways. But be warned, it's dangerous. The entity won't let go without a fight." Sarah hesitated but took the book. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "I just want my son to be safe." That evening, Sarah locked herself in the attic and began preparing. The ritual required salt, candles, and an item tied to the entity's origin. She gathered everything she could find that belonged to Elias Blackthorne, an old pocket watch, a photograph, and a rusted key. She marked a circle on the attic floor with salt and positioned candles at its points. As the sun set, the room grew colder, the air heavy with an unspoken threat. When everything was ready, she called Ethan upstairs. He protested weakly but obeyed. Sarah positioned him in the center of the circle, her heart breaking as she saw how frail he had become. "Whatever happens, don't leave the circle," she instructed him. He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. Tom returned home just as Sarah lit the last candle. Hearing the commotion, he stormed into the attic. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. "There's no time to explain," Sarah shouted. "Just trust me." Before Tom could argue, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow, pooling like black ink. The entity had arrived. The shadowy figure materialized at the edge of the circle, its form flickering and shifting. It loomed over Sarah, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. "You dare defy me," it growled, its voice shaking the walls. "This child is mine." "No," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "You have no power here." She began to chant the incantation from the book, her voice rising above the entity's snarls. The candles flared, their flames growing unnaturally tall. The air crackled with energy as the circle began to glow. The entity roared, its form twisting violently. It lunged toward Ethan, but the circle held, repelling it with a flash of light. The ground shook, and the attic seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. "Stop this," the entity screamed. "You do not understand what you are dealing with." Sarah didn't falter. She finished the chant, shouting the final words. The salt circle erupted in blinding light, and the entity let out a piercing scream. Its form began to disintegrate, pulled toward the center of the circle. For a moment, Sarah thought it was over. Then the light flickered. The entity lashed out, knocking Sarah backward. The salt line broke, and the circle's power faltered. Sarah scrambled to her feet, panic surging through her. The book, she needed the book. Tom, finally grasping the gravity of the situation, grabbed the book and began chanting the incantation himself. His voice was shaky, but it worked. The circle reignited, trapping the entity once more. Together, Sarah and Tom chanted the final lines. With a deafening roar, the entity imploded, vanishing in a burst of light. The room fell silent, the oppressive cold lifting. Ethan collapsed into Sarah's arms, unconscious but alive. Over the next few days, Ethan's health deteriorated rapidly. He barely ate and often woke screaming in the middle of the night, his body drenched in sweat. His once bright eyes were now sunken, and his voice, when he spoke at all, sounded hollow. One evening, Sarah found him sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television, which was tuned to static. "Ethan?" she called softly. He didn't respond. She approached him and gently touched his shoulder. He turned to her slowly, his movements mechanical. "He says it'll stop hurting if I go to him," Ethan murmured, his voice eerily monotone. Sarah crouched beside him, her heart pounding. "Who says that, sweetheart?" "The man in the shadows," Ethan replied, his gaze distant. "He's waiting for me in the attic." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. She pulled Ethan into a tight embrace, as if holding him could shield him from the entity's grip. The night Sarah attempted the ritual was bitterly cold, colder than any night in early autumn had any right to be. She had scoured every corner of Blackthorn Manor for items tied to Elias Blackthorn's presence. Among the dust and decay, she had unearthed an old wooden box filled with his belongings, letters, a cracked photograph, and a strange, jagged crystal wrapped in black cloth. The crystal felt unnaturally warm to the touch, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Sarah didn't know what it was, but instinct told her it was important. She placed it in the center of the salt circle, alongside a locket Ethan had worn as a baby. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she called Ethan and Tom to the attic. "I know this sounds insane," she said, her voice quivering, "but something in this house is trying to take Ethan. I found a way to stop it, but I need your help." Tom stared at her, disbelief and fear mingling on his face. "You're scaring me, Sarah." "Good," she snapped. "Because I'm terrified." Reluctantly, Tom agreed. He held Ethan's hand as Sarah finished preparing the circle. She handed Tom a candle and gave him firm instructions. "No matter what happens, keep Ethan in the circle," she said. "And don't step outside of it." As Sarah lit the final candle, the air shifted. It became thick, oppressive, and heavy with a metallic tang that burned her nostrils. The flickering flames cast long, distorted shadows on the attic walls. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves. But as Sarah chanted the incantation, they grew louder, merging into a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced into a single form at the edge of the circle. It was no longer vague and flickering. Now it was tall, almost human-like, but grotesquely wrong. Its limbs were too long, its torso unnaturally thin. Where its face should have been, there was only a void, but its glowing eyes burned with ancient, malevolent intent. "You've meddled enough," the entity snarled, its voice like shattered glass scraping against steel. Tom gripped Ethan's hand tighter as the boy began to cry. "I don't like this, Mom," Ethan whimpered. "I know, baby," Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's almost over." The entity lunged at the circle, but the salt line held firm, sparking like an electric fence. It howled in rage, its distorted form writhing. You think you can defy me? This is my domain. Sarah's hands shook as she flipped the brittle pages of the book, searching for the final incantation. The entity shifted its focus to her, its form towering above her like a storm cloud. You will not win, it growled. Its voice reverberated through the attic, shaking the walls. He belongs to me. Sarah shouted the final words of the incantation, and for a brief moment, the entity faltered. Its form began to unravel, pulled toward the glowing crystal at the circle's center. The attic trembled, and the air filled with a deafening roar. But then the crystal cracked. A pulse of dark energy surged through the attic, extinguishing the candles. The salt line broke, and the circle's protective power collapsed. No! Sarah screamed as the entity surged forward, its form now larger, more solid. Tom grabbed the book and began chanting. His voice was weak, shaky, but it bought Sarah enough time to relight the candles. The entity turned its wrath on Tom, swiping at him with an elongated arm. He ducked, narrowly avoiding its grasp. You cannot stop me, the entity bellowed. Its voice shook the very foundation of the house. I was here before your kind crawled from the dirt, and I will remain long after you are dust. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah grabbed the jagged crystal. It burned her hands, but she held on, thrusting it toward the entity. You were never meant to be here, she shouted. The crystal glowed brighter, a searing white light that pierced the entity's shadowy form. It shrieked, a sound so piercing that Sarah thought her ears might bleed. The light grew, engulfing the entity, until it imploded in a burst of darkness and flame. The attic fell silent. Tom and Sarah carried Ethan downstairs, their legs trembling from exhaustion. The boy stirred, opening his eyes for the first time in hours. Is he gone? Ethan asked weakly. Sarah stroked his hair, tears streaming down her face. Yes, sweetheart. He's gone. But as they left the house that night, Sarah felt an unease she couldn't shake. The entity was banished, but Elias's journal had warned her, the doorway could never be fully closed. A week later, the manor burned to the ground. As the family watched from a distance, Sarah thought she saw something in the flames, a figure, tall and flickering, watching her with glowing eyes. For weeks after fleeing Blackthorn Manor, life for Sarah, Tom, and Ethan felt like they were living in the shadow of a nightmare. They rented a modest house several towns away, a far cry from the grandeur of the manor but brimming with a sense of safety they hadn't felt in months. Ethan slowly recovered, regaining color in his cheeks and a sparkle in his eyes. But he wasn't entirely the same. He'd grown quiet and introspective, often retreating to his room to draw or write. Sarah occasionally peeked at his sketches, finding page after page of swirling shapes and dark, looming figures. One day, she asked him about the drawings. Are these dreams, sweetheart? Ethan hesitated, his pencil hovering over the page. Not dreams, he said softly. Memories. Sarah's stomach tightened. Of what? Of him, Ethan replied. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with an ancient wisdom that didn't belong to a child. He's still watching, Mom. The news of Blackthorn Manor's destruction spread quickly. Arson was ruled out, there was no evidence of accelerants or human interference. The official report simply stated that the fire's origin was unknown. But Sarah couldn't let it go. She drove back to Blackthorn a month after the fire, her chest tightening as she approached the charred ruins. The once magnificent house was reduced to a skeletal husk, its grand arches and intricate woodwork blackened and crumbling. As she walked through the rubble, Sarah felt an oppressive weight settle over her. The air was heavy, as if the ground itself mourned the house. She stopped where the attic had been, now nothing more than a pile of ash and twisted beams. There, half buried in the debris, she found it, the crystal. It was cracked and blackened but still faintly pulsing with an unnatural warmth. Against her better judgment, she reached down and picked it up. The instant her fingers touched the jagged surface, a whisper slid into her mind. "We are not gone." Sarah dropped the crystal, her breath hitching. It sank into the ash, disappearing from sight as if the earth had swallowed it. She fled without looking back. Ethan's behavior grew more peculiar as the weeks turned into months. He began waking up in the middle of the night, speaking in his sleep. At first, his murmurs were unintelligible, but Sarah soon realized he was speaking in a language she didn't recognize. One night, she found him standing at the window, staring into the darkness. "Ethan," she called softly. He turned slowly, his expression vacant. "He's waiting for me," Ethan said, his voice flat and monotone. "Who is?" Sarah asked, her pulse quickening. "The man in the shadows," Ethan replied, as though it were the most obvious answer in the world. Tom dismissed it as lingering trauma, but Sarah wasn't convinced. She began sleeping in Ethan's room, her nights filled with restless dreams of the entity. In her dreams, it stood at the edge of her vision, its glowing eyes unblinking, as if waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah visited the local antique store in their new town, searching for anything that might help banish the lingering unease. Among the dusty shelves, she found an elderly man tending to the counter. His piercing blue eyes seemed to see right through her. "You're carrying something dark," he said abruptly, his voice gravelly. Sarah froze. "Excuse me." "Something followed you," he continued, stepping closer. "From a place it wasn't meant to leave." She felt the blood drain from her face. "How do you know that?" The man smiled sadly. "I've seen it before. I've dealt with it before." He handed her a small vial filled with a shimmering silver liquid. "This won't destroy it, but it'll buy you time. Pour it where it lingers, and it'll weaken its hold. But remember, once it has touched you, it never truly lets go." Sarah stared at the vial, her hands trembling. "Is there no way to stop it?" The man's expression darkened. "Stopping it would mean facing it on its terms. Few survive that." Months later, the family's fragile peace shattered. It began subtly, Ethan's toys moving on their own, the sound of faint whispers in the dead of night, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. One evening, as Sarah tucked Ethan into bed, he grabbed her wrist. His grip was stronger than she expected, his eyes wide and frightened. "He's coming back, Mom," Ethan whispered. Before Sarah could respond, the lights flickered, and the room grew icy cold. The shadows in the corner stretched and coiled, forming a dark mass that loomed over them. Tom burst into the room, but the shadow lashed out, throwing him against the wall. Sarah screamed as the entity's glowing eyes fixed on Ethan. "You cannot escape me," it hissed. "You belong to me." Sarah fumbled for the vial the old man had given her, spilling its contents onto the floor. The silver liquid hissed and bubbled, creating a shimmering barrier. The entity recoiled, its form flickering. But it wasn't enough. Summoning her courage, Sarah grabbed Ethan and shouted to Tom, "Get the car." They fled into the night, leaving everything behind. As they drove, Ethan clutched Sarah's hand, his voice shaking. "He's not gone, Mom," he whispered. "He'll never be gone." Life in the new apartment was uneasy but manageable, for a while. Ethan seemed better, his nightmares less frequent, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was waiting for its moment to return. The encounter in the kitchen window haunted her, the glowing eyes etched into her mind. When she found herself unable to sleep, Sarah delved into books, forums, and obscure archives, seeking anything that might help her permanently banish the shadow. It was during one of these sleepless nights that she stumbled upon a peculiar entry in a forgotten corner of an occult forum, the Seeking Stone. The post, written in fragmented sentences, described an artifact said to seal ancient doorways and banish malevolent entities. It spoke of a powerful relic hidden in a forgotten monastery high in the Carpathian Mountains. The message was cryptic and rife with warnings, but it ended with a chilling promise. Find the stone, and you may find peace. Fail, and it will consume you. Sarah felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. The next morning, she told Tom. "You want to go to Romania?" he asked, incredulous. "We can't live like this," Sarah argued. "We're not safe here, or anywhere. If this is real, it's our only chance to end this for good." Tom hesitated, but the fear in her voice convinced him. By the week's end, they had made arrangements. The journey to the monastery was grueling. The narrow roads wound through dense, ancient forests, where the gnarled trees seemed to whisper secrets to one another. Ethan grew restless, complaining of headaches and strange dreams. "I see him in the trees," Ethan said one night as they camped on the edge of the forest. "Who?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "The shadow man," Ethan replied, shivering. "He's following us." The next morning, they arrived at the ruins of the monastery, perched precariously on the side of a rocky cliff. It was a crumbling stone structure, its once grand arches overgrown with moss and vines. The air was heavy with a sense of timelessness, as if the place existed outside of the world. Inside the monastery, they found a lone figure, an old monk who introduced himself as Father André. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp with knowledge and sorrow. "You've come seeking the stone," he said, his voice soft but commanding. Sarah nodded. "We needed to stop something that's haunting us." Father André studied her for a long moment before sighing. "The seeking stone is not a weapon, it is a key. To use it is to invite a confrontation you may not survive." "Then tell me what to do," Sarah said, desperation breaking through her composure. The monk led them deeper into the monastery, through winding corridors and down crumbling staircases. They entered a chamber where the air was thick and charged with an otherworldly energy. In the center of the room, on a pedestal carved with ancient symbols, rested the seeking stone. It was a smooth, black orb, its surface swirling with faint, silvery veins. The sight of it sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "You must be certain," Father André said. "Once you take the stone, the entity will know. It will fight you with all its strength to remain in your world." Sarah hesitated but glanced at Ethan. The dark circles had returned under his eyes, and his small body seemed too fragile for the burden he carried. "I have to do this," she said. Father André explained the ritual. It would require Sarah to confront the entity directly, using the seeking stone to sever its connection to this world. The process would be dangerous. If her will faltered, the entity would consume her and grow even stronger. That night, they prepared the chamber. Father André marked the walls and floor with protective symbols, using powdered silver and salt. Candles were placed in precise patterns, their flames casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. As Sarah held the seeking stone, she felt a surge of energy, both invigorating and terrifying. Whispers filled her mind, not unlike the ones she'd heard in Blackthorn Manor, but this time, they were distant, almost pleading. "It's starting," Father André warned. The shadows in the room deepened, coalescing into the form Sarah dreaded most. The entity appeared, more solid and monstrous than ever. Its glowing eyes locked onto her, and it let out a guttural laugh. "You cannot banish me," it growled. "I am eternal." Sarah gripped the seeking stone tightly and began the incantation Father André had taught her. The words felt foreign on her tongue, but their power was undeniable. The entity attacked, hurling itself at Sarah with a force that shook the chamber. The protective symbols flared to life, holding it back, but each strike weakened the barrier. "You think you can sever me?" the entity roared. "I am bound to him." It pointed a clawed hand at Ethan, who screamed and collapsed to the floor. Sarah's voice wavered, but she pressed on, the seeking stone glowing brighter with each word. The entity howled, its form unraveling as if pulled by an invisible force. It lunged toward Sarah, but this time, she didn't flinch. She held the seeking stone aloft, its light engulfing the chamber. With a final, piercing scream, the entity disintegrated into a cloud of ash and shadows, drawn into the orb. The stone grew cold in Sarah's hands, its glow fading. When the light dimmed, the room was silent. Ethan stirred, his face pale but peaceful. "Is it gone?" he whispered. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's gone." Father Andre helped them to their feet, his expression grave. "You have severed its connection to this world, but the stone must be hidden again. Its power is too great to remain in human hands." Reluctantly, Sarah handed the orb to him. She felt a pang of loss but knew it was the right choice. As they left the monastery, the first rays of dawn broke over the mountains, casting the ruins in a golden light. For the first time in what felt like years, Sarah felt a sense of peace. Months passed. The family's life seemed to return to normal, or as close to normal as it could after everything they'd endured. Ethan smiled more, Sarah and Tom argued less, and the oppressive weight that had hung over their lives lifted. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their peace was temporary. Nightmares plagued her, vivid dreams of the seeking stone glowing in the dark and the entity whispering from the shadows beyond. She didn't tell Tom about the dreams, nor did she share how sometimes, when she glanced into reflective surfaces, she caught a glimpse of glowing eyes. She dismissed it as paranoia, a leftover trauma from their ordeal. Until the letter arrived. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah found an envelope on their doorstep. There was no return address, and the paper felt unnaturally cold to the touch. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an ancient symbol drawn in black ink, the same symbol Father Andre had used to protect them during the ritual. Below it, in spidery handwriting, were the words, "The stone is awake." Sarah's breath caught. She ran her fingers over the symbol, her mind racing. Who could have sent this? Father Andre? Someone else? She flipped the paper over. Scrawled on the back was a location, Blackthorn Manor. Sarah didn't want to go back to the manor. Every fiber of her being screamed to leave the letter alone, to burn it and forget. But the words haunted her. The stone is awake. Could it mean the entity wasn't truly banished? Could the orb have fallen into the wrong hands? She debated for days, hiding the letter from Tom. But when Ethan began waking in the middle of the night again, muttering about the shadows, she knew she couldn't ignore it. Sarah returned to Blackthorn Manor alone. The sight of the charred ruins sent shivers down her spine. The once mighty structure was now a skeletal remnant, its blackened beams clawing at the gray sky like twisted fingers. The air was colder than it should have been, and the silence was deafening. She stepped over the rubble, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. At the center of the ruins, where the attic once stood, she found a fresh circle of salt and silver. In its center was the seeking stone. It pulsed faintly, the silvery veins within it glowing like dying embers. As Sarah reached for the stone, a voice echoed through the ruins. "Did you really think it would be so easy?" She spun around, her flashlight trembling. The shadows seemed to gather and coalesce, forming the shape she dreaded most. The entity emerged, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "You severed me," it hissed, "but you did not destroy me. And now, you've brought me back." Sarah's heart pounded. She looked down at the seeking stone. It was glowing brighter, pulsing in sync with the entity's movements. "This world will never be rid of me," it growled. "I am bound to you and the boy. I will always find you." Desperation took over. Sarah picked up the stone, its surface burning her skin. She felt its power surge through her, its whispers flooding her mind. "You think you can wield it?" the entity laughed. "You are nothing." But Sarah remembered Father Andre's words, "The stone is a key." She focused on the whispers, forcing her mind to interpret them. The language was ancient, the words slippery, but she grasped their meaning. Open the door. A wind howled through the ruins as Sarah chanted. The stone grew heavier in her hands, its light blinding. The entity roared, its form becoming unstable. No, it screamed. You don't understand what you're doing. But Sarah didn't stop. She pushed through the fear, through the pain, and completed the incantation. The ground beneath her split open, revealing an abyss of swirling light and shadow. A force pulled at the entity, dragging it toward the chasm. It clawed at the ground, its screams reverberating through the air. You will regret this, it howled. You cannot contain what lies beyond. With one final surge, the entity was pulled into the abyss. The light dimmed, the ground sealed, and the stone in Sarah's hands shattered into 1,000 pieces. Sarah stumbled out of the ruins, her body trembling. She thought it was over. But as she reached her car, she felt it, a faint vibration beneath her feet, as if the earth itself was stirring. The shadows around the manor seemed darker, more alive. And then she heard it, a deep, resonant voice, far more powerful than the entities. You opened the door. Sarah's blood ran cold. She realized with dawning horror that the entity wasn't the true danger. It had been a guardian, a fragment of something far older and far worse. The door wasn't just a prison. It was an invitation. The days following Sarah's return from Blackthorn Manor were filled with a growing unease. The shadows in her modest apartment seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Doors creaked open without explanation. And the air felt thicker, heavier, charged with a presence she couldn't see but could feel, always lingering. Ethan, who had seemed to recover, began drawing again. But now, his pictures were different. They were no longer of the shadowy man, instead, they showed twisted landscapes, ancient cities submerged in darkness, and towering figures with too many eyes and limbs that defied comprehension. What is this, Ethan? Sarah asked, holding one of the drawings. It's what's coming, he said simply, his voice hollow. One night, as Sarah lay in bed, a low rumble woke her. At first, she thought it was thunder, but it was too steady, too rhythmic. It seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Then she heard it, a voice deep and resonant, speaking in a language she didn't understand. It wasn't a whisper like the entity's voice had been, this was a guttural chant, echoing as if from the depths of the earth. Sarah bolted upright, her heart racing. Tom! Wake up! But Tom didn't stir. He lay motionless, his face pale and his breath shallow. Panicking, she shook him harder, but it was Ethan who appeared in the doorway. He's dreaming, Ethan said, his small frame silhouetted by the hallway light. Dreaming of what? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Ethan's eyes seemed far older than his years. Of them. The next morning, news reports flooded in from around the world, strange occurrences in places tied to ancient myths and legends. In the ruins of an abandoned temple in Turkey, archaeologists reported finding hieroglyphs glowing with an unearthly light, despite being untouched for millennia. In the depths of the Amazon rainforest, an entire village vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a series of intricate carvings depicting monstrous beings. In Iceland, the northern lights took on a blood-red hue, accompanied by tremors that cracked the earth in geometric patterns. Sarah recognized some of the images from Ethan's drawings. Mom, Ethan said quietly as she turned off the TV. They're waking up. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah reached out to Father Andre. She wasn't sure if he would respond, she didn't even know if he was still alive after the ritual at the monastery, but desperation drove her to try. To her surprise, he called back the next day. His voice was strained, as if he were speaking from the edge of exhaustion. You opened the door, he said without preamble. I didn't have a choice, Sarah shot back. It was the only way to stop the entity. There was always a choice, Andre said grimly. That door was sealed for a reason. What you released is older than time, older than humanity. It is hunger incarnate, and it will not stop until it consumes everything. Then tell me how to stop it. Sarah pleaded. There was a long silence. I don't know if it can be stopped, Andre admitted. But there may be something, a fragment of knowledge, hidden in the ancient city of Deretter. Where is that? Andre's voice lowered. It doesn't exist in this world. You will have to go where the lines between realms blur. Sarah, Tom, and Ethan embarked on a journey unlike any they had faced before. Guided by cryptic instructions from Andre, they sought out a convergence point, a place where the veil between their world and the ancient dimension of Deretter was thin. Their search led them to the catacombs beneath a crumbling castle in Eastern Europe. The air was frigid, and the darkness was so complete it seemed to swallow the light from their flashlights. Mom, it's here, Ethan whispered, clutching her hand tightly. At the center of the catacombs, they found an archway carved with the same symbols Sarah had seen in Blackthorn Manor. The air shimmered like heat waves, distorting the space beyond the arch. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. Stay close, she told her family. Then, hand in hand, they stepped through. The world on the other side was a nightmare made real. The sky was an oppressive shade of gray, swirling with black clouds that moved as if alive. The air smelled of decay and burned metal. The city of Deretter stretched out before them, its architecture impossible by human standards. Towers spiraled into the sky at impossible angles, bridges wove through the air like vines, and the ground beneath their feet pulsed faintly, as if the city itself were breathing. Do you hear that? Tom asked, his voice trembling. Sarah nodded. The chanting had returned, louder and more insistent, reverberating through the very stones of the city. Guided by Ethan, who seemed eerily attuned to the place, they navigated the labyrinthine streets. The city felt alive, watching them, testing them. At one point, shadows peeled away from the walls and took humanoid forms, their glowing eyes identical to the entities. But these were not the same. They were lesser fragments, echoes of the true force. The family fought through them, barely making it to the city's center, a massive temple carved from a single, unbroken slab of obsidian. Inside, they found a throne. On it sat a being both magnificent and terrifying, a colossal figure with shifting features, its body adorned with glowing runes. Its eyes burned with a light that seemed to pierce through Sarah's soul. You dare come before me, the being intoned, its voice shaking the ground. The being introduced itself as Therynx, the forgotten hunger, an ancient god banished by humanity's ancestors to preserve the fragile balance of the world. You have torn the seal, Therynx said, its tone a mix of anger and amusement. And now I shall feast. Sarah stepped forward, clutching a talisman Father Andre had given her. If you're so powerful, why were you imprisoned? She demanded. Therynx laughed, a sound that rattled the walls. Because even gods can fear. They feared my truth, all things exist to be devoured. And now, that truth shall be realized. As Therynx's laughter echoed through the temple, Sarah stood her ground, clutching the talisman tighter. The oppressive presence of the ancient being weighed heavily on her, pressing against her mind, her soul. You speak of truth, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. But truth cannot be destroyed, it can only be hidden. If you are so invincible, why were you bound for so long? What weakness made it possible? Therynx leaned forward, its enormous form casting the room into shadow. Its ever-shifting features flickered, momentarily revealing hollow sockets where its eyes had burned. Weakness, it thundered. There is no weakness. Only betrayal. It was your kind, pathetic mortals, who struck the pact that caged me. The cost was their own suffering, their own deaths. But their chains have weakened. And now, I am free. Sarah's mind raced. The word pact lingered in her thoughts like a lifeline. If a pact had been made to imprison Therynx, then there must have been knowledge of its vulnerabilities. Ethan, Sarah whispered, pulling her son close. Do you feel anything here? Like you did at the manor? Ethan stared up at Pharynx, his small hand gripping Sarah's tightly. His wide eyes gleamed with a strange understanding. There's something under the throne, he said softly. Pharynx's laughter ceased, and for the first time, it turned its gaze directly on Ethan. The boy sees too much, it said, its voice lowering to a dangerous growl. Run! Sarah shouted. The family darted around the throne, dodging the tendrils of shadow Pharynx summoned to stop them. Tom shoved a heavy stone aside, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the earth. Go! Tom urged, shielding Sarah and Ethan as they scrambled down the steps. The air grew colder as they descended. The oppressive weight of Pharynx's presence lessened, but the chanting grew louder, echoing off the stone walls. At the bottom of the staircase, they found a small chamber lit by an eerie green glow. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it rested a chain forged from an otherworldly metal. Symbols similar to those on the seeking stone were etched into its surface, glowing faintly. It's the chain that bound him, Sarah whispered, awe and fear mixing in her voice. As Sarah reached for the chain, a voice filled the chamber, not Pharynx's but something older, softer. To bind the devourer is to know his name. To unmake the devourer is to sever his hunger. What does it mean? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Ethan stepped forward, his small hands hovering over the chain. It means he's not as strong as he wants us to think. He needs people to fear him. That's what feeds him. The symbols on the chain flickered, responding to Ethan's touch. Sarah's mind flashed back to Father Andre's teachings. Entities of Pharynx's kind were sustained by belief, by reverence or terror. If we take this, she said, we sever his connection to the fear that feeds him. He'll weaken. The chamber shook violently as Pharynx's enraged voice roared from above. Step away from the chain, mortals, it bellowed. You think you can defy me? I am the end of all things. Tendrils of shadow slithered down the staircase, reaching for them. Tom grabbed a chunk of stone and began smashing at the walls, trying to collapse the passage. Take the chain, he shouted to Sarah. Sarah hesitated, but Ethan's voice brought her back. We have to do it, Mom. It's the only way. Steeling herself, Sarah grabbed the chain. The metal was cold and unnaturally heavy, its symbols flaring to life the moment she touched it. A pulse of energy shot through the room, knocking the shadow tendrils back. Back in the throne room, Pharynx loomed larger, its form flickering erratically. The family emerged from the staircase, the chain glowing with an intense light. You cannot destroy me. Pharynx roared, its voice shaking the very ground. No, Sarah said, holding the chain aloft, but I can sever you from what makes you strong. She wrapped the chain around her hands and began to chant. The words weren't hers, they came unbidden, as if whispered into her mind by the chain itself. Pharynx howled, its tendrils thrashing wildly. The light from the chain enveloped the temple, burning away the shadows and revealing the true form of the god, a massive, hollow figure, its body riddled with fractures. As Sarah's chant reached its crescendo, the fractures in Pharynx's form widened. Its once powerful voice grew faint, almost pleading. No. I am eternal. I cannot end. With a final surge of energy, the chain shattered, its shards dissolving into light. Pharynx let out a deafening scream as its form collapsed in on itself, vanishing into the abyss. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan looked up at Sarah. Is it over? Sarah knelt beside him, pulling him into a tight embrace. I think so, she whispered, though a part of her wasn't certain. When they stepped back through the portal into their world, the air felt lighter, the oppressive weight gone. The news of strange occurrences around the globe ceased, as if the world itself had exhaled. But Sarah knew the cost of their victory. Pharynx was gone, but the balance of the universe had shifted. The door was still open, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something else might step through. For now, though, the hunger was silenced. The world had returned to a strange sense of normalcy, but Sarah knew it was fragile. As the family began to rebuild their lives, they noticed subtle changes. The nightmares that had plagued them started to fade, but the whispers still clung to the edges of their thoughts, a reminder of what they had encountered. Yet, the door, the one they had unwittingly opened, remained in the fabric of reality. It wasn't closed. It wasn't sealed. It was still there, somewhere beneath the surface, just waiting for something, or someone, to cross it again. One morning, Ethan came to Sarah with a piece of paper in his hand. It was one of his drawings, a sketch of a symbol she had never seen before, an interlocking series of circles, with a line running through them, forming a perfect triangle. "I saw it in my dream," he said, his voice soft and distant. "Another dream?" Sarah asked, concerned. "Not like the others," Ethan replied. "This one felt real. Like it was happening right now." The symbol wasn't something Ethan could have come up with on his own. She recognized it, though she couldn't place where, from the strange symbols they had encountered in Duretter and the ancient ruins of Blackthorn Manor. The door wasn't just a doorway to Pharynx, it was a gateway to something else. Something older and far more ancient. Sarah's unease grew over the next few days as she researched the symbol Ethan had drawn. She found nothing in modern texts, but the more she dug, the deeper the history went, until she stumbled upon a myth that chilled her. The symbol represented something called the Watchers, beings that had existed before even Pharynx. They were not gods in the traditional sense. They were ancient entities, older than time itself, existing beyond the fabric of creation. The Watchers had once been the architects of the cosmos, building the very structure of the worlds. But they were not benevolent creators. They had built for control, for their own mysterious purpose. The myth described how they had vanished after a great catastrophe, leaving behind their doors scattered across different realms. These doors weren't simply gateways, they were anchors, tethers that kept the Watchers' influence at bay. But if one door were opened, if one tether were broken, their influence would seep back into the world. And when that happened, everything would bend to their will. The first sign that something was wrong came when the stars began to behave strangely. The constellations shifted, their familiar patterns warping and twisting, as if something were reshaping the very fabric of the universe. Sarah and Tom stood in their backyard one night, staring at the sky. Ethan was asleep inside, but he had already mentioned the changing stars to them earlier. Tom put his arm around Sarah as they both stared up, the cold air biting at their skin. "You don't think," Tom started, his voice trailing off. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice tight with fear. "But I can't shake the feeling that something's coming." And then it happened. The stars in the sky blinked out, one by one, as if they were being extinguished by some unseen hand. The darkness that followed was unnatural, swallowing the entire horizon. For a moment, Sarah felt like the world had stopped. Time had ceased to exist. The silence that followed was suffocating. Suddenly, a piercing light exploded from the center of the sky, brighter than the sun. It was a swirling, chaotic vortex, twisting and turning in impossible shapes. It was a doorway, a door to something unimaginable. Sarah rushed inside, her heart pounding. She found Ethan standing in the hallway, wide-eyed, staring at the same sky through the window. "Mom, what is that?" he whispered. Before Sarah could answer, the light from the vortex flickered and split, forming a path that led directly to them. The path of light twisted, bending toward their house, toward the door. "It's happening again," Ethan said, his voice strangely calm. "The Watchers are coming." The ground beneath them shook. Tom grabbed Sarah and pulled her toward the basement, where they had hidden the remnants of the seeking stone and the chain that had bound Pharynx. The symbols etched into the wall around them began to glow faintly, as if reacting to the shift in the air. "We need to figure out how to close the door," Sarah said, desperation creeping into her voice. If the watchers are coming through. Before she could finish, the air in the basement grew colder. A gust of wind blew through the room, carrying with it a faint, melodic hum, almost like a song, but one that sent chills down her spine. Then the shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch, slowly gathering in the center. A figure materialized from the darkness, tall, shadowed, and dressed in robes that seemed to shimmer and distort like smoke. It was a watcher. Its voice, when it spoke, was like the creaking of 1,000 broken worlds. "You have awakened the door, mortal." Sarah took a step back, clutching Ethan's hand tightly. "Who are you?" The watcher tilted its head, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "I am the last of the watchers. And I have come to reclaim what was once ours." "We don't want any part of this," Tom said, his voice shaking but determined. "You were locked away for a reason." The watcher laughed, low and cold. "You misunderstand. I do not come for destruction, though that may be a part of it. No, I come for something much more precious. The keys to your world are scattered, and I must collect them. The door you opened was only the beginning. The watchers have always held dominion over the paths between worlds." Sarah's mind raced. The door they had opened had unlocked the watchers' influence, but it wasn't enough. The watchers needed to reclaim what was theirs, and the price for that would be their dominion over the entire realm. She felt the pressure build as the watcher's eyes bore into hers. "You can help me," it said, its voice a soft caress. "You hold a part of the key, mortal. You've touched the chain. And I can offer you knowledge, power. You could help us restore balance. What's the cost?" Sarah demanded. The watcher's smile was sharp, like the edge of a blade. "The cost? Your world, in its entirety. We will take what is ours and remake it as it once was. You will have a place at my side, as my ally. The darkness that envelopes this world will be yours to command." Sarah's heart sank. The deal was tempting, too tempting. But she had seen the price of power, of making deals with forces far older and more dangerous than anything she could imagine. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We won't be a part of this." The watcher's smile faded. The air in the basement grew thick with oppressive energy as it stepped closer. "Then I have no use for you." With a wave of its hand, the room began to distort, the walls stretching and warping as though they were made of liquid. The watcher's form flickered like a candle in the wind, and the space around them seemed to collapse in on itself. "Run!" Sarah shouted to Tom and Ethan, as she pulled them toward the stairwell. But as they fled, Sarah knew one undeniable truth: the watchers were not just coming for them. They were coming for everything. The doorway had opened, and there would be no closing it now. The air around Sarah, Tom, and Ethan crackled with an unnatural energy as the watcher's form continued to warp and distort in front of them. The walls of the basement stretched like rubber, bending and twisting with the force of the entity's will. "Run, Sarah!" Tom shouted, but his voice sounded distant, as if the very air around them were pressing in, suffocating. But Sarah couldn't run. Not this time. The Watcher's power was not just in its form, but in the knowledge it offered, a knowledge that could undo everything they had fought to protect. And Ethan. Ethan had already seen too much. As the family reached the top of the stairs, the Watcher's voice rang out in a strange language, one that felt ancient, almost forgotten. "There is nowhere to run. The threads of your reality are mine to weave. You cannot escape what has already been set in motion." But Sarah had no intention of running anymore. "Tom, get the seeking stone," Sarah called, her mind racing. Tom nodded, rushing to the cabinet where they had hidden the stone. The air hummed with the Watcher's presence, but for a brief moment, the house fell silent, Sarah's fingers gripping the cold talisman in her pocket as she reached deep into her memories of the night they had faced Tharynx. She could feel the seeking stone's energy vibrating as Tom pulled it from its hiding place. The stone had been a weapon against the entity, a force of ancient knowledge meant to disrupt the balance between realms. But against the Watchers, it might be their only hope. Tom handed the stone to Sarah, its warmth spreading through her fingers. For a moment, everything felt still. Then the Watcher laughed. "Do you think that little trinket can stop me? It was never meant to hold me back," it sneered, its voice now an unbearable crescendo, shaking the foundation of the house. "The Watchers are beyond such fragile tools. We are the fabric of reality itself." Sarah's grip tightened on the stone. There was no time for doubt, no time for hesitation. She had no choice but to believe in the power they had once wielded, before it was too late. As she held the seeking stone high, the walls of the basement cracked open, and the Watcher's form seemed to fracture further, dissolving into 1,000 shifting reflections of itself. It reached toward her, its many hands sprouting from every direction. The room felt like it was being pulled apart at the seams. But Sarah was ready. She spoke the words that had come to her in a flash of realization, the same words that had once bound Pharynx. "By the chain, by the door, by the name unspoken, return what has been broken." The stone blazed to life, sending a pulse of radiant energy across the room, illuminating the twisted shadows. For a brief moment, Sarah felt herself drawn into the stone's power, as though it was connecting her directly to the hidden currents of the world. The Watcher screamed, a sound that wasn't fully human, and the shadows around it writhed like serpents. "No. You cannot." But it was too late. The seeking stone's energy began to unravel the Watcher's form. The Watcher screamed in fury and desperation, but its voice was now distorted, fading into the surrounding chaos. The stone's glow brightened, and Sarah could feel the threads of reality fraying. Time itself seemed to stretch, becoming fluid, like a river flowing backward. A new kind of understanding flooded her mind, an ancient knowledge of how the realms were woven together. The Watcher wasn't merely a being. It was part of a greater system of balance that kept all things in place. And now that balance was teetering. In the midst of the maelstrom, Ethan stepped forward, his eyes wide with a clarity that unnerved Sarah. He was no longer the frightened child he had been. The boy who had seen too much was now something else. "I know what we need to do," Ethan said, his voice firm. "The Watchers can't be defeated by force alone. You can't undo what's been done. But we can lock them out. If we cut off their connection to this realm, they will fade away." Sarah looked at her son, who was speaking with the confidence of someone far beyond his years. He had always been sensitive, able to see things others couldn't. But this? This was something different. "How?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of sound tearing through the room. Ethan pointed to the seeking stone. "The stone is a key. It opens paths, but it also closes them. We need to use the stone to close the door. The light, the path you saw earlier, it's not just a way in, it's a way out. If we close the door on the Watchers, they will have no way to reach us. No way to return." The Watcher's form grew more unstable by the second. Its hands, once reaching, now clawed at the air as if trying to tear the very fabric of the universe. "You cannot escape," it howled. "I will remake this world." But Sarah had no intention of letting that happen. With Ethan's guidance, she raised the seeking stone once more and began chanting the words she had found in the ancient text. The stone began to hum, a low, resonant sound that vibrated deep within her bones. The walls of the room pulsed with energy, responding to the stone's power. Slowly, the Watcher's form began to lose cohesion, its image flickering, as though reality itself was rejecting it. "No," the Watcher rasped, its voice full of terror. "No. You will not lock me away again." But Sarah, her voice strong, called out the final words. "By the chain, by the door, by the name unspoken, close the path between worlds." In that moment, a blinding flash of light erupted from the seeking stone, engulfing the watcher in a wave of pure energy. The entity screeched as its form unraveled, its once powerful presence dissolving into nothingness. The door, the swirling vortex in the sky, flickered and blinked out of existence, leaving only darkness in its wake. When the light dimmed, the house was silent. The air was still, free of the oppressive force that had once suffocated them. Tom, his face pale, approached Sarah and Ethan. "Is it over?" Sarah looked at Ethan, who stood in the middle of the room, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom that was beyond his years. "For now," she said, her voice filled with both relief and a lingering sense of unease. "But the door, it's still out there." Ethan nodded. "The watchers are locked out, but the doors remain. We have to make sure it never opens again." And as Sarah held her son close, she realized the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The door, the watchers, and the darkness they brought with them had all been sealed, but Sarah knew that their world was never truly safe. The ancient forces were always waiting, hidden in the shadows, watching. Weeks had passed since the Watcher's defeat, and Sarah had hoped that life would slowly return to normal. They had closed the door, the shimmering path that had once torn the fabric of reality. The world felt peaceful once more, but something remained, an unsettling hum that seemed to vibrate beneath the surface of everything. It wasn't the remnants of the Watcher's presence, it was something else, something far older. The family had resumed their routines, trying to rebuild what they could from the wreckage of their past. Yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of the true consequences of what they had unleashed. Ethan had become withdrawn, often staring at the stars late into the night, lost in thoughts that seemed beyond his years. Tom, though outwardly calm, had grown increasingly distant, as if he were sensing something he couldn't explain. And then, there were the dreams. One evening, Ethan came to Sarah with a strange look in his eyes. His skin was pale, his breath quick, as if he had just run a long distance. "Mom, something's wrong. The Watchers, they're still watching." His voice trembled, though he tried to sound calm. "Ethan, we sealed the door," Sarah said, kneeling down to look him in the eye. "You and I, we stopped them. It's over." But Ethan shook his head, his small hand gripping hers tightly. "It's not over. The door might be closed, but it's not forgotten. You can feel it too, can't you? The hum. It's under everything." Sarah took a deep breath. Ethan had always been sensitive to things others couldn't see or hear, but she had hoped the boy's visions would fade. Instead, his warning seemed to be growing stronger. "Mom, the Watchers aren't gone. They're trapped in the cracks between worlds, but they can still reach through. They're looking for ways in. I don't know how, but I feel it." She stared at him, unsure of what to say. She had believed the danger was over, but something in Ethan's eyes told her he wasn't imagining things. The next night, Sarah sat alone in the living room, the lights dimmed, her mind turning over everything that had happened. She could still feel the pulse of the seeking stone in her hands, that last rush of energy before the Watcher had been cast out. It had been powerful, beyond anything she had ever known, and it should have been enough to sever the connection between their world and the Ancient One. And yet, the hum remained. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Startled, she rose and opened it. Standing there, bathed in the glow of the moonlight, was an old man. His clothes were worn, but he had a certain dignity about him, as though he had seen centuries pass. His eyes, pale and clouded, seemed to see through Sarah rather than at her. "You must listen to me," the old man said, his voice gravelly but urgent. "The Watchers may be sealed, but the damage is already done. They have left their mark on the world." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her pulse quickening. The old man stepped forward, lowering his voice. "The cracks between worlds are more fragile now. The Watcher's presence was never fully contained. It only takes the right force, someone with the right knowledge, to tear them open again. And when that happens, everything you know will be undone. He paused for a moment, as though gathering strength. The seals you placed on the door are temporary at best. They're anchored in the fabric of reality, yes, but they can weaken. The Watchers will find ways to stretch their influence. They've already begun. The next few weeks were a blur of strange occurrences, events that didn't seem to fit the natural order of things. It began small, an odd, shifting shadow in the corner of Sarah's eye, flickers of light where none should have been. Then came the whispers, low and distant, but always there, no matter how hard Sarah tried to ignore them. Ethan's dreams grew more vivid, and the boy spoke of visions, of dark, twisting forms rising from the cracks in the sky. He described voices calling to him, telling him that the world had been forgotten, that it was too late. The most disturbing change, however, occurred when Sarah began to feel the world shift around her. One night, while sitting in the kitchen, she swore she saw the door to the basement tremble slightly, as if some unseen force was pushing against it. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then she realized something more terrifying: the door was never completely still. That night, the door creaked open, just a fraction, as though inviting her in. With growing fear, Sarah turned to the only place she could think of for answers, the library of old journals and texts she had gathered from her search for the seeking stone. She'd stored them away, thinking they were no longer necessary. Among the yellowing pages of the oldest journals, she found something that sent chills through her spine. The Watchers had never been truly vanquished. They were part of an ancient, cyclical pattern, their rise and fall tied to the movement of stars, the turning of time itself. Each time they were pushed back, their influence grew stronger, their power less reliant on direct contact and more reliant on subtle, hidden corruption. They had once been gods, it seemed, creators of worlds, destroyers of time. And Sarah realized something terrible: the Watchers had seeded their influence into the very fabric of human history. What they had created wasn't just a door, it was a thread. A thread that had already woven itself into every corner of human existence. As Sarah read the final pages of the journal, her eyes grew wide with horror. It described a ritual, a way to sever the Watchers' influence entirely. But the ritual was ancient, dangerous, and it required a terrible sacrifice. It could only be performed by someone who had come into direct contact with the Watchers' power, a conduit through which the forces of the Watchers would be purged forever. Sarah's breath quickened as she realized the implications of what she had read. The Watchers were not just waiting to return, they had already begun to infiltrate the world again. The cracks they had left behind were spreading, infecting everything they touched. The nightmares started once more. This time, however, they weren't just in Sarah's mind. They were real. She woke up in the middle of the night, her body cold with sweat, only to find the walls of her room bending in strange angles. The door in the hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should have, as though it were a portal to somewhere else, somewhere dark. Ethan was the first to sense the change. "They're closer now, Mom. I can feel them. The Watchers, they're looking for me." Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped that with the door closed, they had truly stopped the horrors from returning. But now it seemed as though the world itself was unraveling. The whispers, the distortions, the feeling of being watched, it was all tied to the Watchers' influence. And the worst part? She could already sense that it was too late to stop it now. The next few days were a blur of frantic searching, sleepless nights, and increasingly desperate conversations with old friends, occultists, and scholars who had once helped Sarah during her research. All of them spoke of the same thing, the ritual. But none knew how to perform it, and none knew the true cost of what it would require. It was as though the world had conspired to bury the truth, to keep them from ever fully understanding the Watchers and their ancient ways. The more Sarah delved into the journals and texts she had gathered, the more a terrifying realization began to take shape. The Watchers had seeded the ritual into the world in many ways, disguised in different forms, across different cultures, hidden beneath centuries of myth and superstition. The ritual wasn't a single spell or incantation. It was an intricate, complex series of events, a convergence of celestial alignments, sacrifices, and human will. Each element had to be placed just so, or else it would fail, and the Watchers would return stronger than ever. It was a paradox. To rid the world of the Watchers, they would have to confront the very thing they had fought to avoid, the entity's ancient origin. The Watchers weren't just interdimensional beings. They were part of the world's creation, a product of the primal forces that shaped the universe. To end their influence, Sarah and her family would have to trace those forces back to their source, to an unknown realm, a place beyond time and space, where the Watchers could be locked away for good. Ethan, his face pale and worn from sleepless nights, told Sarah that he had been receiving more messages, visions, whispers from the Watchers themselves. He described their words as if they were in his head, as though they were trying to seduce him back to them, promising him power and knowledge beyond comprehension. The boy had always been sensitive to such things, but now he seemed to be at the center of it all. "I think they want me to open the door again," Ethan said one morning, his eyes sunken, filled with dread. "But I won't let them. I can't." Sarah's heart broke for her son. He was no longer the innocent child who had first stumbled upon the Watcher's influence. He had become something different, torn between the realms, aware of the forces that no one else could see. "You won't have to," Sarah assured him, trying to sound confident. "We're going to stop them. We're going to finish this once and for all." To perform the ritual, Sarah knew they would need help. Help from those who had knowledge beyond the mundane, those who had touched the edges of the arcane and understood the forces at play. She called upon an old friend, Professor Richard Farrow, a scholar of ancient rites and forbidden knowledge, who had helped her years ago during her initial encounters with the Watchers. He had always been skeptical of her warnings, but he couldn't deny the evidence now. The Watchers were real, and they were returning. "You found it, haven't you?" Richard said when Sarah showed him the texts she had been poring over. "The ritual, the convergence. It's a nightmare waiting to happen." His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, the ancient symbols and words seeming to pulse with an energy of their own. "But there's more. You're not just dealing with the Watchers here. You're dealing with something older, something that was never meant to be known. It's a force that predates the Watchers themselves. The ritual is not just about locking them away. It's about rewiring the very foundation of reality." Sarah felt a chill. Rewiring the foundation of reality. The words felt heavy, laden with untold consequences. "If we fail, it's not just the Watchers that will return," Richard continued, his voice quiet. "It's all the forces they represent. Chaos, entropy, and destruction. And there's no way of knowing what we might unleash in the process. This could tear everything apart." Despite the danger, Sarah knew that there was no other choice. The Watchers had already begun to infiltrate the world again, and there was no guarantee that even with the ritual, they would be able to stop them. But it was their only hope. "We have no choice," Sarah said firmly. "We have to do this." The ritual was set to take place on the night of a rare celestial event, a full lunar eclipse that would align the planets in such a way that the Watchers' influence would be at its peak. It was then that the doorway between worlds would be the weakest, when their power could be turned against them. Sarah, Tom, and Ethan gathered in the old basement once again, this time joined by Richard and a few trusted allies who had experience with the occult. The air was thick with anticipation, and the hum of the Watchers' presence seemed to press in from every direction. They stood around a large circle drawn in chalk, the symbols from the ancient texts scrawled onto the floor in a pattern that would lock the Watchers away forever, if they succeeded. Sarah's heart raced as she looked at the objects laid out before them, ritual candles, ancient relics, and the seeking stone, now glowing faintly in the dim light. Ethan stood at the center of the circle, his eyes closed in concentration. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, the weight of what they were about to attempt. She looked at Tom, his face etched with concern. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "There's no other choice," Sarah said. "We can't let them return. Not now." As the moon began to rise, casting an eerie glow through the basement windows, Sarah and the others began chanting the incantation from the journals. Each word was more difficult than the last, and the air around them grew heavier with every passing moment. The walls seemed to tremble, the very foundation of the house shifting as the ritual reached its peak. Ethan's voice joined theirs, his tone low and almost otherworldly. It was as if something deep inside him had awakened, something that understood the gravity of what they were doing. Suddenly, the basement door burst open with a violent force. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles in an instant. The Watcher's presence filled the room, dark and suffocating. Their voices echoed in Sarah's mind, the words distorted, almost broken. "You think you can stop us?" the Watcher's voice rang out, seeping through every crack and crevice. "You cannot break what has already been woven." But Sarah didn't falter. With the last words of the incantation, she held the seeking stone high, channeling all the energy she had left into it. The stone flared to life, and for a brief moment, she saw the door again, the crack between worlds. She saw the Watchers, their writhing forms, their insatiable hunger. And then, with all the power she could muster, she slammed the stone into the center of the circle. The world seemed to shudder. The light from the stone exploded outward, and the Watchers screamed, their forms destabilizing, flickering like shattered glass. The entire basement shook as if the very ground beneath them was being torn apart. Sarah, Tom, and Ethan were thrown backward, but they held on to each other, their bodies crumpling to the floor as the force of the ritual pulsed through the house. In that moment, Sarah could feel it, the Watcher's influence slipping away. The fabric of reality was ripping at the seams, but instead of unraveling, it was being rewoven. The door, the thread that had connected them to the Watchers, began to close. But something was wrong. In the last moments before everything collapsed into darkness, Sarah saw the Watchers' true form. Not as the shadowy, distorted figures they had appeared as, but as something far worse, an abyss of endless blackness, a swirling void that threatened to consume everything. And within that void, a single whisper reached her ears, a chilling promise. "We will return." When Sarah awoke, everything was still. The hum that had once filled the air, the subtle vibration of otherworldly influence, was gone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world seemed quiet. Peaceful. She was lying on the cold floor of the basement, her hands pressed against the cracked stone tiles, her body aching as if she had been tossed around in a storm. Ethan and Tom were beside her, groaning as they slowly regained consciousness. The seeking stone lay nearby, dim and inert, its glow extinguished. The room was unnervingly silent. "Mom." Ethan's voice was small and fragile, as though he were unsure of what had happened. He looked up at her, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Is it over?" Sarah struggled to sit up, her mind still trying to catch up with what had just transpired. She could feel it, the weight of the ritual, the sheer force of the ancient power that had been unleashed. It had been a close call, too close. And yet, there was a lingering sensation, a nagging feeling at the back of her mind. Despite the silence, despite the lack of immediate danger, something felt unfinished. "Ethan, I don't know," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know if it's really over." Tom groaned beside her and slowly sat up, rubbing his head. He looked around at the dim, unbroken circle that had once been the epicenter of their ritual. His gaze met hers, and the concern in his eyes was unmistakable. "The house, it feels different. Like it's holding its breath." Sarah nodded. She felt it too. It wasn't just the house. It was the world itself, as though the forces that governed it had been momentarily altered, stretched thin, and now were slowly knitting themselves back together. Ethan shuddered, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Mom, I think I felt them, the Watchers. In the ritual." Right before everything went dark. I saw them, and I heard them. They whispered that they'll return. They said it wasn't the end. Sarah's heart sank. They said it wasn't the end. The ritual had been powerful, but had it truly sealed them away? Or had it only pushed the Watchers into a dormant state, one that would allow them to come back when the time was right? The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that the Watchers' defeat had never been as simple as closing a door. They were ancient, predating human civilization and reality itself. Perhaps the door wasn't a barrier at all, but a gateway that connected multiple layers of existence, a thread woven through the very fabric of the universe. In that instant, Sarah understood something terrifying: sealing the Watchers hadn't destroyed them. It had only contained them. For now. Richard Farrow, the scholar, had been right. The Watchers had touched everything in the world, every myth, every culture, every nightmare. They were tied to the chaos of creation itself. It was impossible to truly sever their connection to the world. But there had to be more. There had to be a way to stop them permanently, a way to sever their influence not just in this world, but in every layer of existence they touched. And, perhaps, there was a hidden power within the Watchers' ancient knowledge, a weakness no one had yet discovered. Weeks passed, and the days settled into a new normal. But the strange sense of unease lingered, growing with each passing day. The world outside was calm, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they had not yet faced the full consequences of what they had done. Ethan grew more withdrawn. He stopped speaking of the Watchers' whispers, but his eyes became haunted, as though he could still feel their presence in his mind. Sarah had tried to reassure him, but she knew the battle wasn't over. The boy could sense things she couldn't, and if he said they were still watching, she believed him. One night, Sarah received a strange visitor, an archaeologist named Dr. Claudia Moore. She was a woman Sarah had never met, but her name had come up in one of the obscure occult texts Sarah had read months ago. Dr. Moore claimed to have uncovered something that might be connected to the Watchers, an ancient temple hidden deep in the wilderness, a place that held secrets long forgotten by the world. They were here long before us, Dr. Moore explained one evening, sitting across from Sarah in the dimly lit living room. The Watchers, I mean. They weren't just confined to other dimensions, they left traces behind in our world, in the very ground we walk on. My team and I found a temple, buried beneath layers of earth and time. We believe it was a place of worship, a place where people tried to commune with them. But there's something more, something darker hidden within. Sarah listened intently, her curiosity piqued. Could this temple hold the answers they needed? Could it hold a secret, a weapon, that could destroy the Watchers once and for all? I need your help, Sarah, Dr. Moore continued. This temple might be the key to ending their influence. But we have to be careful. There's something in that place, something waiting. I think the Watchers left a part of themselves there. Sarah, Tom, and Ethan joined Dr. Moore and her team on an expedition to the temple. The journey took them deep into the mountains, through dense forests and treacherous terrain. The deeper they traveled, the more oppressive the air became, as though the very land itself was thick with an ancient, suffocating presence. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the heart of the Watchers' domain. As they approached the entrance to the temple, Sarah felt a coldness that seemed to freeze her very bones. The temple was hidden beneath a cliff, the entrance veiled by overgrown vines and rock. But as Dr. Moore's team began to clear the debris, a sense of foreboding grew stronger. There was something deeply wrong here, something not just ancient, but alive. Inside, the walls were covered with carvings, intricate and disturbing. They depicted strange beings, twisted and contorted, their faces blank and featureless, surrounded by swirling patterns that seemed to shift when Sarah wasn't looking directly at them. Look, Dr. Moore said, her voice reverberating off the stone. This is the key. This is what the Watchers wanted to communicate. But as she reached out to touch one of the carvings, a sudden burst of energy filled the room. The air thickened, crackling with static, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The ground trembled beneath their feet. "No!" Dr. Moore cried out, stepping back in horror. "We've triggered something." The temple shook violently, and an eerie, shrill sound echoed through the chamber, as if the walls themselves were screaming. Shadows flickered in the corners of the room, but they didn't move like ordinary shadows. They writhed, twisted, and pulled themselves into strange, unfamiliar shapes. The Watcher's presence filled the room once again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a roar, a crushing force that felt as though it was trying to pull them into the depths of some unknown abyss. "They're awakening!" Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible over the din. "The temple is a trap. We have to leave." But as they turned to flee, the entrance to the temple sealed itself shut with a thunderous crash. They were trapped. The stone doors of the temple shuddered as the echoes of the Watcher's roar reverberated through the air, a sound so pure in its malevolence it seemed to warp the very fabric of time and space. The shadows inside the temple were no longer merely dark, they were alive, moving with intent, pulsating with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, the heartbeat of the Watchers themselves. Sarah, Tom, and Ethan were pinned against the wall, the oppressive atmosphere crushing them. They had to act fast. The temple itself was a trap, one designed not to imprison the Watchers, but to draw their energy back into the world, to reclaim what had been taken from them centuries ago. "We have to get out of here," Sarah gasped, struggling to stand as the ground beneath them trembled. But as she moved toward the door, she saw something, someone, emerging from the shadows. A figure appeared at the far end of the chamber, wrapped in a cloak of darkness, the same shifting, featureless face that Sarah had seen in the carvings. It was one of them. The Watchers had found a vessel, an avatar, one of their own, sent to take form in the physical world. Dr. Moore, standing beside Sarah, was the first to react, her eyes wide with recognition. "No, no, it's not possible," she whispered. That's him, the first Watcher. The one who sought to open the door." Sarah turned her gaze back to the figure, dread crawling up her spine. The Watcher's form seemed to pulse and undulate, and as it moved closer, it emanated an unnatural coldness, like a void that swallowed light itself. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes filled with an almost resigned certainty. He had known this moment was coming, hadn't he? He had always sensed it. "No, Ethan!" Sarah shouted, but it was too late. Ethan was already reaching out toward the Watcher, as if drawn by some invisible force. The Watcher's voice filled the room, low, resonant, yet oddly calm. "You think you have stopped us. But you have only delayed the inevitable. The ritual was never to end us. It was to give us the strength to return." "No!" Ethan cried, his voice trembling as his hand touched the Watcher. The moment his skin made contact, a pulse of energy shot through him, and his body went rigid, his eyes flashing with an unnatural light. "Ethan!" Sarah screamed, rushing to her son. But as she reached him, Ethan's face contorted in agony. His body twisted and shuddered, as though something was growing inside him, something monstrous and unfathomable. His eyes locked onto Sarah's, but there was no recognition in them. Only the cold, ancient emptiness of the Watchers. "Mom, help me!" Ethan's voice was a faint whisper, barely audible over the growing roar that filled the temple. The shadows around them seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the Watchers were feeding off the boy's pain, drawing strength from him. The Watcher smiled, a grotesque mockery of a smile. "We have already returned, little one. Your son is now the vessel through which we will return to the world. His body, his soul, will be the key to our dominion." Desperation gripped Sarah's heart. She couldn't lose Ethan, not this way. But she knew, deep down, that the only way to save him would be to sever the connection between the Watchers and the physical realm, once and for all. "Tom," she shouted, her voice filled with resolve. "The stone, the seeking stone. We have to use it to sever the bond." Tom, standing by her side, nodded grimly. He pulled the stone from his bag and held it aloft. Its faint glow returned, a last ember of power. But it was weak. It wasn't enough. "Sarah!" Dr. Moore cried. "It's not enough. The stone was never meant to contain this kind of energy." She was right. The Watchers were more than just interdimensional beings. They were a force of nature itself, ancient, primal, beyond the reach of any single object or incantation. The seeking stone was only a temporary solution, a barrier, not a weapon. But then Sarah saw it. She understood what she had to do. With a strength she didn't know she had, Sarah grabbed the seeking stone from Tom's hands and pressed it against Ethan's chest. The Watcher hissed, the shadows around them writhing in fury. "No. You do not understand. You cannot sever the bond. It is part of you now." But Sarah didn't flinch. She had to believe that there was a way. She had to. "Ethan!" Sarah cried, as if calling her son back from the edge of some unfathomable abyss. "You are stronger than them. You are more than their vessel. Fight them." Ethan's body jerked violently, his chest heaving as he struggled against the dark force that had claimed him. The Watcher screeched, a sound so shrill it made Sarah's ears bleed. But the stone began to glow brighter, the ancient runes inscribed on it shimmering with an ethereal light. The Watcher reached out, its hand a mass of shifting darkness, but the light from the seeking stone pushed back, burning its touch. With a final, agonizing cry, Ethan's form collapsed, his body falling limp in Sarah's arms. For a long moment, everything was still. Then, with a loud crack, the walls of the temple shook violently, and the shadows began to recede. The Watcher's voice faded into nothingness. The air cleared. It was over. Sarah held Ethan tightly in her arms, her heart pounding. Tom and Dr. Moore stood close by, their eyes wide with shock, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The seeking stone had dimmed to a faint glow, its power spent. For a long while, there was nothing but silence. Then Ethan stirred. "Mom." His voice was weak, but there was no trace of the Watcher's presence in his eyes. He was himself again. The darkness had been lifted. Sarah's heart swelled with relief as she hugged him tightly. "Ethan, you're okay. You're okay." The temple around them was now just an ancient ruin, its oppressive aura dissipating. The walls no longer whispered. The shadows no longer moved. And yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the Watchers had not been entirely vanquished. They had been pushed back, perhaps for now, perhaps for good, but Sarah knew that darkness had a way of lingering, of returning when least expected. As they made their way back to the surface, Sarah turned one last time to look at the temple. The door was still sealed, but she knew deep in her bones that this battle was far from over. There would always be forces out there, lurking just beyond the veil, waiting for the right moment to strike. But for now, they had won. And that would have to be enough. Years passed, and Sarah and her family tried to rebuild, to forget the horrors they had faced. They moved away from the haunted town, hoping that their lives could return to something resembling normalcy. But Sarah kept the seeking stone, hidden away in a secret place, a reminder of the power they had confronted, and the price they had paid. One night, as Sarah sat by the fire, she heard a whisper in the wind. A voice, faint and familiar. "We will return." The Watchers had not forgotten. They never would. And one day, they would rise again.